Hello, ACLU. I'm Kary Moss. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU, and I want to welcome you tonight to the ACLU's annual dinner. All right, that's the spirit. It is so good to see you all here. In fact, I want you all to turn to your neighbor and give each other a hug. That's right. Oh, awesome. Awesome. I needed that. Well, I suspect that none of us got much sleep these last few nights. Luckily for me, I had something to keep me busy rewriting tonight's speech. We're going to dispense, actually, with our usual program. You're going to hear from me, and then eat dinner, and then hear from our keynote speaker, Jose, because this is a night of real importance. For those of you who've been coming to the dinner for years, you know that we always talk about our accomplishments, and I will tell you about some of them, but this year feels very different because it is. So, let's get some stuff out of the way. First, this was a presidential campaign unlike any other. It was a campaign that sowed fear, that put a bullseye in the back of so many Americans, our friends, our neighbors, our families, our communities. The country's angry, the country's divided, the country is tired. Many are shaken by the racist, homophobic, and sexist sentiments that came out of this campaign, and many others are saying my voice was finally heard. I'll be honest with you. Thinking about all the issues and causes I've cared about and worked on for my whole professional life, there's no question that there's some dark days ahead. It feels like a repudiation of the progress we've made over these last decades. But every one of us in this room knows that we can't dwell in the darkness. We have too much work to do. Fortunately, there are lanterns lighting the way if we leverage the brilliance and passion in this room and around this state and across this country if we work creatively and together. I got more. So I want to start by telling you a story. Last week, ACLU of Michigan Legal Director Mike Steinberg and I went to Washington. Yeah, let's have a round of applause for Mike. We went to Washington because the Supreme Court had taken one of our cases. The case involved a little girl named Elena Fry who has cerebral palsy. And while she uses a walker, her doctor had prescribed a service dog who could help her achieve independence. Unfortunately, when she started school at the age of 5, the school would not let her bring the dog, saying that the adults could help her. And we filed a case under a federal disability law and lost in the trial court, and then we lost again in the Court of Appeals. To our surprise, the Supreme Court took the case. So last week, we took Elena, who's now 13, and her family to the Supreme Court. As is the usual practice, we waited in line for several hours to enter the courtroom, with no accommodation being made for Elena, who had to lean into her walker for that entire time. The argument went well. It was a lively bench, and when it was over, we went to meet the press outside on the massive Supreme Court front steps. After navigating the wheelchair-accessible route, which takes you around the Supreme Court about a quarter of a mile, we landed in the middle of the front steps near the fountain where the press usually waits. But that day, they had told the press to actually go all the way to the bottom, another 50 steps down. So Elena had a choice to either go back and walk a quarter of a mile around to get down those 50 steps. So Mike instead looked at her mother, and her mother said, let's do it. And so Mike and Elena's dad picked her up and carried her down. She had a huge smile on her face to the waiting press corps below. So we had lost in the schools. We had lost in the court twice, but we kept going. We came up against difficult physical obstacles, but we kept going. We did everything we had to do to make sure that little girl's voice was heard. And so on behalf of Elena and so many others, I'm here to tell you, we in the ACLU did not spend the last 10 decades defending our Constitution, standing up for the disadvantaged, and protecting the dispossessed, only to turn back now. Like many of you, I've spent the past several days speculating about what comes next. The road ahead is going to be hard. It's murky. It's full of hazards. But the first thing I want to say to you is that we have to tell our children and all children that we, the grown-ups, are going to make this right. There's a little girl here tonight, Hala Kogali. Where are you, Hala? Hala, who I know has been feeling really nervous. And I just wanted to say to you that everything is going to be okay. Hala, everybody in this room loves you and your family. Let's give her a round of applause. And I say this because we know children are afraid, don't we? Haven't we heard this? In the weeks and months ahead, there will be soul searching about the why and how this happened. We're not going to do that tonight. Here's what I do know and what I can tell you. We are going to fight like hell. Turning back is not an option. As I watched Elena speak to the press on the steps of that imposing marble courthouse, I thought of the ghosts that had walked those same steps: Justice Thurgood Marshall, Justice Earl Warren, the giants of civil rights law. I thought of all the people who had climbed up or down steep paths to get to that court with the ACLU and the NAACP, facing what felt like were insurmountable obstacles. Mildred and Richard Loving, who stood up for the right to marry. Linda Brown, who took on legal segregation in public schools. High school teacher John Scopes, who stood up for the right to teach evolution in public school classrooms. Fred Korematsu, who challenged the internment of Japanese Americans. Ernesto Miranda, who stood up for the right to remain silent. Planned Parenthood Executive Director Estelle Griswold, who stood up for the right to use contraception. Clarence Gideon, who stood up for the right to a court-appointed lawyer if you can't afford one. Norma McCorvey of Roe v. Wade, who stood up for the right to decide whether and when to have a child. And Edie Windsor, who brought down the Defense of Marriage Act and set the stage for the right to marry. All of these people overcame great obstacles: racism, legal segregation, community hostility, violence, uncontrolled police power, to tell their story, to make their case, to stand up for their rights. But they didn't do it alone. They were part of a larger movement: Seneca Falls, Selma, Stonewall. They were supported by lawyers and activists and family members and neighborhood associations, churches, mosques, and synagogues. It is in our collective power and the brilliance, oh, I forgot it. I'm holding up a Constitution. This document right here, that we will not turn back, we will come out stronger. We have a genius Constitution. It gives us a mechanism to correct ourselves over and over again. It gives us the values that guide us on the long road to fairness, equality, and freedom. While imperfect, it has held America together for over 200 years. Presidents come and go, but the Constitution stays. There are reasons that people like Khizr Khan hold it up. The United States is the only country in the world where the officers of government, the officers of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines swear their allegiance to the Constitution, not to the king, not to the state, not even to the nation, but to the Constitution. That's how strong this country is in its devotion to this document. And it's a document that's created by the people of the United States. For that reason, it's different than any other law that gets passed in this country. It is our heart and soul. It is embedded in our DNA, and it is not going anywhere. I know that tonight you are worried about the resilience of the Supreme Court. So am I. But I have faith and trust in this document. James Baldwin once said, "Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." Well, it's our job to challenge that ignorance and check uncontrolled power. This document is our shield and our sword. In the face of impossibility, this document is the American experience, the struggle for democracy, the widening of the horizons of equality, liberty, freedom, and justice. We have been through difficult times before, and this has been our engine. The ACLU was founded 100 years ago, almost, during the Palmer raids of the Red Scare, a time when people were truly scared about the future of this country and the world. We fought Joseph McCarthy, we fought J. Edgar Hoover, we fought the Bush administration's anti-terrorism policies, right, that were crammed through Congress and led to the FBI roundups of Middle Eastern men and the closing of deportation hearings to the press and the public. In all those times, the outlook was bleak, but we marshaled our resources, we built coalitions, we filed cases, we organized, we held the line, and we came out stronger. Our collective power is at its greatest when we come together around a shared vision, when we combine forces, and when we use whatever tool is needed to get the job done. Again and again, in my years doing this work, I have seen lawyers, social workers, librarians, teachers, doctors, students, elected officials, and scientists stand up, cross party lines, to do the right thing, and not only in the courts. I have watched wonderful coalitions come together, our allies, Planned Parenthood, Equality Michigan, the American Constitutional Society, Access, the NAACP, so many others. We have sat down, we have sat in, we have marched, we have dissented, we have organized, and we get creative. Just 1 year ago, exactly, we were here in this very room honoring Flint community activists, Dr. Mona Hanna, Atisha, pastors, and the ACLU's investigative reporter, Kirk Guyette, for their work bringing to light the water crisis in Flint. I know that many of you were here last year, and you heard us tell that story, and we told that story before it had broken internationally. It was the story of how we had rolled a boulder up the mountain when nobody would listen, in a city where democracy had been suspended, where there was no lawsuit to file, where the people in Flint had no hope at all. But it was the collective action of that group that forced the state to return the city to the Detroit water system, and the world was given the language to describe the horror of what happened there. Dr. Mona, who documented the high blood levels of children before and after the water switch, has said, "We thought our research, that science would be enough. It wasn't. But with all those voices beside me, the state backed down." Remember them talking about her slicing and dicing? Who could have guessed how events would unfold this last year when we shared that story with you? We had no idea. Who knew that good old investigative reporting, science, diligence, and community organizing would call into account government inaction, delay, intransigence, arrogance, and incompetence? Yep. Who would have guessed that we could, with the help of the Immigrant Rights Center and 60 other organizations, stop the state from requiring residents to produce identification in order to get water? Who would have guessed that we could force the state to translate public health information into different languages? Who would have guessed that we could persuade the Department of Human Services to implement deportation-free zones so people could get bottled water? We were nimble. We opened a temporary office in Flint to investigate conditions for immigrants, the public schools, and people living in public housing. We filed a lawsuit with the Natural Resources Defense Council to replace the lead pipes in the city, and I'm happy to announce that yesterday a federal judge ordered that bottled water be delivered to every home in Flint. And I'm also happy to tell you that just a few weeks ago we filed a federal class action to make sure that the public schools there are safe, lead-free, and delivering a quality education to all children. What we will need to do is what we've always done, maybe bigger, maybe bolder, maybe better, but we know how to challenge systems in courts, in legislatures, in communities. We know how to demand and get accountability and defend and protect the most vulnerable. I know that during this campaign, I was particularly disheartened and demoralized and enraged by Trump's challenge to the legitimacy of our country's first African-American president. I will never get over that. But let's be real. Let's be real. The underbelly of racism we saw this year is not new in America. It's not new in Flint. It's not new in Detroit. We've seen it before. Right now, Detroit is facing the largest tax foreclosure crisis since the Great Depression, a crisis that's leading to thousands of evictions because of unpaid taxes that should not have been assessed to begin with. For 2 decades, our client, Julia Akins, worked to make sure that others were cared for. A medical assistant in a nursing home, she spent the better part of her career looking after the elderly. Now, at age 67 and living in an East Side Detroit home, she's at risk of losing her home. Our client, Walter Hicks, was denied a poverty exemption because another person with the same name owned a separate piece of property, which the city counted as its asset. Even though it was the city's error, he's at risk of losing his home. Our client, Sperlin Moore, who's 77 and lives on Social Security, has been asked to pay mounting tax bills on a house that's been grossly overvalued. He's at risk of losing his home. And our client, Edward Knapp, a Navy veteran who served in Vietnam and has since struggled with homelessness, bought a home 5 years ago, which he may now lose. We're representing them in one of the most important cases ever filed under the Fair Housing Act. Each of these individuals stepped up, not just for themselves, but for their neighbors, their neighborhoods, their Detroit. They formed neighborhood associations, they raised money to help each other out, they found allies, and they turned to the law. And I want to express our deep appreciation to each of them who are here with us tonight. Being a party in a lawsuit is not easy work, especially if you have health challenges, transportation challenges, and are spending every ounce of energy and every dime on trying to hold on to your home when you feel hopeless and when the system is stacked against you. Well, I want to ask them tonight to stand up and be recognized for their heroic efforts to save thousands of Detroit families. And I want to thank the law firm of Covington & Burling, and we have a lawyer here representing them tonight, Sarah Tremont, who've worked so